I want you to pay very close attention to what you have been feeling today, because the tension building around this moment may be revealing something that has been operating inside your life far longer than you realized. I have been watching this pattern develop for weeks, and as it reaches this point, it feels increasingly difficult to ignore. If you've noticed yourself becoming unusually tense, impatient, restless, emotionally charged, or physically unable to fully relax, there may be a reason for that feeling. Today, August 16th, Mars and Pluto are moving into one of the most psychologically intense alignments of the entire year, a quincunx, which is a 150-degree angle between them. The technical name may sound distant or complicated, but the experience of this transit can feel deeply personal. This is not necessarily the kind of energy that arrives with an obvious announcement. Instead, it can quietly expose the hidden mechanism behind a reaction you keep having, a fear you keep avoiding, a habit you keep repeating, or a decision you keep making without understanding why you are making it. Imagine living in a house for years and suddenly discovering that one room has been locked the entire time. You may have sensed that something existed behind that door, but you never had a clear reason to investigate it. Today, the symbolism of Mars and Pluto suggests that the door is becoming impossible to ignore. Mars at 3 degrees, Cancer forming that exact 150-degree relationship with Pluto at 3 degrees, Aquarius, and the tension between these two energies can bring attention towards something that has remained outside your normal awareness. The important part is that this transit is not simply about discomfort. It can become an opportunity to recognize what has been influencing you from the background, because once a hidden pattern becomes visible, you have a greater chance of responding to it consciously instead of allowing it to continue directing your behavior automatically. That distinction matters more than you may realize. When you understand an energy, you can work with it. When you remain unaware of it, you may find yourself acting through it. That is why I do not see this moment as something meant simply to frighten you. I see it as an invitation to become honest about what has been happening beneath the surface. There is another reason this moment carries so much weight, and that is the timing. This Mars and Pluto alignment is not occurring by itself. You are still moving through the aftermath of the total solar eclipse in Leo that took place on August 12th, and that eclipse has already created an opening in the psychological landscape. Your normal defenses may not feel as solid as they usually do. The emotional armor you rely on to keep certain feelings contained may have become thinner. Things you normally dismiss may suddenly bother you. Memories you thought were finished may feel strangely close. A conversation that would normally roll off your shoulders may suddenly affect you for hours. Even your body may be communicating something before your conscious mind can put words around it. You may feel your shoulders tightening, your muscles bracing, your breathing becoming shallower, or an unusual sensation that you are preparing for something even though you cannot identify what that something is. If that has been your experience over the last several days, do not immediately assume that you are simply being difficult, overly sensitive, or irrational. The story unfolding here suggests that the psychological atmosphere created by the eclipse is meeting the pressure of Mars and Pluto at precisely the moment when hidden tension can become harder to ignore. The eclipse in Leo already began a process of exposing questions about identity, pride, recognition, and the version of yourself you have been presenting to the world. Now this Mars and Pluto connection can push that process deeper toward the motivations underneath the identity itself. This is why the sequence matters. The eclipse came first, and then this intense alignment arrives while you are still processing what the eclipse opened. On August 12th, the total solar eclipse occurred in Leo, and eclipses are often associated in astrology with periods of significant reset and change. A solar eclipse temporarily interrupts the ordinary experience of light, and symbolically the return of that light can represent a new awareness of something that was previously difficult to see. In Leo, the emphasis falls strongly upon the ego, identity, self-expression, and the personal story you carry about who you are. This particular eclipse also occurred on the South Node, placing emphasis on release. The symbolic message was not simply to become someone new overnight. It was to recognize what you may have been carrying that no longer belongs in the next version of your life. That can include performing for approval, adjusting yourself to satisfy everyone else, seeking validation, or holding on to an outdated identity because it once made you feel protected. Sometimes people do not realize how exhausting it is to constantly maintain a version of themselves that was created for survival rather than authenticity. You may become so accustomed to being the dependable one, the agreeable one, the strong one, the person who never complains, or the person who always knows what to do, that eventually you forget to ask whether that identity still represents you. The eclipse in Leo, positioned on the South Node, symbolically challenges that attachment. It asks what happens when you stop performing the role that once helped you feel safe. It asks what remains when the approval is removed, when the audience disappears, when nobody is watching, and when you are finally left alone with the truth of how you actually feel. That process can be uncomfortable because the defenses that once protected you may also be the same defenses that prevent you from recognizing what is happening underneath. And this is where today's Mars and Pluto quincunx becomes especially significant. The eclipse may have loosened the armor, and now Mars and Pluto are directing attention toward what the armor had been covering. Think of it as walking into a familiar room after someone has moved all the furniture. The room is technically the same, but suddenly you notice details that were always there and simply hidden by what surrounded them. That is the psychological quality of a blind spot. A blind spot does not mean that something is absent. It means that something can be influencing your experience without being directly visible to you. This is one reason the quincunx can feel so strange. Unlike a square or an opposition, which can present a conflict that is much easier to identify, a quincunx can create a persistent sense of incompatibility without giving you an obvious target for the discomfort. The two planets involved are not naturally speaking the same language. They are associated with different elements, different modes, and very different expressions, and they do not form an easy relationship in which one simply understands what the other is doing. Instead, both energies can pull on you simultaneously, creating the sensation that something is happening inside you without a clear explanation. You may know that something feels wrong without knowing what needs to change. You may feel as though you are pushing forward while something invisible is holding you back. You may become irritated by circumstances that normally would not bother you, only to realize later that the real source of the irritation was somewhere much deeper. It can resemble driving while the handbrake remains engaged. The engine is running. You are pressing the accelerator. You are trying to move, but something unseen is creating resistance. That is the kind of psychological contradiction this transit can symbolize. You are not necessarily facing a visible battle. You may instead be encountering an internal friction that has been quietly consuming energy. Perhaps you've been trying to make a decision and cannot understand why you keep delaying it. Perhaps you have been telling yourself that you are ready to move forward. Yet every time the opportunity appears, another hesitation emerges. Perhaps you keep repeating the same emotional pattern with different people and different circumstances, believing each situation is separate, while something underneath remains unchanged. This is where the symbolism of the quincunx becomes especially revealing. The problem may not be something you can identify by looking outward. It may require you to turn inward and ask what hidden fear, attachment, expectation, or protective habit has been influencing your choices. Mars at 3 degrees. Cancer brings its energy through a sign connected with emotional security, instinct protection, and deeply personal reactions, while Pluto at 3 degrees, Aquarius carries an entirely different quality, one associated in this symbolism with transformation and deeper forces operating beyond the immediate personal level. Their exact 150-degree relationship creates a tension that may feel difficult to translate into a simple explanation. You might experience the emotion before you understand its origin. You might react before you know what has been triggered. You might suddenly realize that the thing upsetting you today is connected to something much older than the situation itself. That realization can be uncomfortable, but it can also be the beginning of freedom. Awareness changes the relationship you have with a pattern. Before awareness, the pattern feels like reality. After awareness, you can begin to recognize it as a pattern. That is the shift this moment may be asking you to notice. The eclipse has already begun removing some of the protective layers surrounding your identity, and today's Mars and Pluto quincunx can illuminate the hidden tension that remained underneath. This does not mean that every uncomfortable feeling should be treated as a cosmic message, but within the astrological story unfolding here, the sequence is important. First, the eclipse in Leo challenged the identity you have been carrying. Then its South Node emphasis brought the theme of release. Now Mars and Pluto arrived through a difficult 150-degree relationship and exposed the blind spot that may have been influencing your reactions from behind the scenes. You may therefore find yourself standing at an unusual psychological crossroads. Part of you may want to return to the familiar version of yourself because familiar patterns feel safer even when they are exhausting. Another part of you may recognize that you cannot keep living according to an identity that no longer fits. That internal contradiction can create tension, but it can also create the exact pressure necessary for recognition. Sometimes awakening does not feel peaceful at first. Sometimes it feels like realizing that the explanation you have repeated for years no longer makes sense. Sometimes the breakthrough begins with irritation, restlessness, confusion, or the uncomfortable awareness that something inside you is asking to be acknowledged. So if today feels unusually charged, pay attention to what repeatedly catches your attention. Notice what makes you defensive. Notice what creates an immediate emotional reaction. Notice where you feel resistance without an obvious reason. Notice the moments when your body seems to respond before your mind has formed an explanation. Within the symbolism of this transit, those reactions may point toward the very blind spot that Mars and Pluto are bringing into view. The eclipse already opened the space, and now this alignment is turning the light toward what was hidden inside it. And once you understand why these two planetary energies are interacting in such a difficult and strangely invisible way, the timing of everything that has happened since the eclipse begins to make much more sense. If you have felt unusually exposed over the past several days, as though the emotional protection you normally wear has suddenly disappeared, do not mistake that sensation for weakness. Within the symbolism of the eclipse, that heightened sensitivity is part of the process. The eclipse has created space around you, and that space can feel uncomfortable because things that were once hidden behind your usual defenses are now easier to sense. You may not have the complete answer yet, but you may already feel that something inside you is changing. Your body may even be recognizing the pressure before your conscious mind has found the words to explain it. This is where the physical side of the experience becomes especially important. Think back over the last few days and notice whether your body has been behaving differently without an obvious explanation. Perhaps your shoulders have remained tense, even when there was no immediate reason to be tense. Perhaps your jaw has tightened while you sleep, or you have awakened realizing that your teeth were clenched. Maybe you have experienced a restless, electrically charged feeling, almost like your entire system has consumed far too much caffeine despite having none. Or perhaps you have carried a persistent low-level headache that refuses to completely disappear. If any of that sounds familiar, I want you to take the sensation seriously rather than automatically dismissing it as imagination. In the astrological symbolism being explored here, Mars is associated with the muscular system, adrenaline, and the instinctive fight-or-flight response, while Pluto represents deep, hidden systemic pressure that can operate beneath conscious awareness. As Mars approaches a difficult aspect with Pluto, the theory is that the body can respond before the conscious mind understands what has activated it. It can feel as though your internal system has detected danger without being able to identify the source of that danger. The result can resemble an alarm that has been switched on without giving you a clear explanation for what triggered it. Your muscles tighten, your body becomes more alert, your stomach contracts, and your nervous system can behave as though it must prepare for something even when there is no obvious physical threat standing in front of you. The deeper point is that the confrontation may not be happening in your external environment at all. It may be taking place inside the psychological landscape. Your body can become the first place where that internal struggle becomes visible because the body does not always wait for the mind to understand what is happening. It simply reacts. That is why a strange physical sensation can sometimes arrive before an emotional realization. You may know that something feels wrong long before you can explain why. You may notice your digestion becoming unsettled in that subtle, persistent way where your stomach simply does not feel completely comfortable. Not necessarily dramatic, not necessarily severe, but enough to make you wonder what has changed. When the nervous system remains in a heightened state of alert, the body can temporarily place less emphasis on functions associated with rest and repair because it is prioritizing perceived danger. In the context of this transit, the suggested danger is psychological rather than physical. Something unresolved may be demanding attention. Something you have avoided examining may be creating pressure beneath the surface. Something connected to fear, vulnerability, or control may be asking to be recognized. So if your body has felt unusual this week, pay attention to the location and quality of that tension within the framework of your own experience. Do not assume every physical symptom has an astrological cause, but do notice what your body is communicating emotionally, because sometimes the first clue appears as a sensation before it becomes a thought. And this leads directly into one of the biggest traps associated with the Mars and Pluto dynamic, the urge to control everything around you. This is where many people may misunderstand what they are experiencing today. When Mars and Pluto interact through an intense configuration, the symbolism can awaken something deeply instinctive. It is not simply ambition or ordinary determination. It can become a powerful internal demand to manage every variable, control every outcome, eliminate every uncertainty, and make absolutely certain that nobody else has the ability to place you in a vulnerable position. From the outside, that behavior can easily resemble confidence. You may appear decisive, forceful, organized, or unusually assertive. But underneath that surface, another emotional current may be operating. The stronger the need to control becomes, the more it may reveal an underlying fear of being powerless. That fear can remain hidden because control often feels safer than admitting vulnerability. You may tell yourself that you are simply being responsible, but notice what happens when something refuses to cooperate with your plans. A minor inconvenience can suddenly produce an unexpectedly intense reaction. You may become irritated with someone over something small and then wonder afterward why the response was so disproportionate. You may feel compelled to check your phone repeatedly, refresh your email, look at someone's social media, follow the news, or verify something that you already checked several times. You may even start an argument with a partner or roommate about something insignificant, only to discover later that the disagreement was never truly about the dishes, the thermostat, or whatever small issue appeared on the surface. The emotional charge came from somewhere deeper. This is where the pattern I think of as the omnipotence-impotence loop becomes useful for understanding the experience. You can move from one extreme to the other. First, you feel that you must take complete control because otherwise you will not be safe. You push harder, speak more forcefully, investigate more intensely, and try to eliminate every unknown. Then, when you encounter something you genuinely cannot control, the energy can reverse completely. You freeze. You feel helpless. You become overwhelmed by the realization that no amount of effort can guarantee the outcome you want. Then the cycle begins again. Push forward, lose control. Freeze, become frustrated, push harder. Neither extreme actually creates the security you are seeking. The trap is believing that greater pressure will eventually produce greater safety. You tighten your grip because you assume that releasing it means losing everything. But the quincunx does not symbolically resolve through greater force. Its lesson is adjustment. It asks for a change in relationship with the thing you are gripping so tightly. It asks whether the effort to control the situation is actually consuming more energy than the situation itself requires. That can be a difficult realization because letting go can initially feel like surrendering your protection. Yet sometimes the deeper surrender is not giving up. It is releasing the belief that you must control every variable in order to survive. That is why this energy can become so psychologically revealing. It shows you where control has become a substitute for trust. It shows you where strength may actually be covering fear. It shows you where determination may have become tension. And if you find yourself becoming unusually obsessive today, that is another pattern worth noticing. Mars and Pluto carry a symbolic connection with intense focus, fixation, digging beneath the surface, and refusing to stop until something has been uncovered. Mars is traditionally associated with Scorpio, while Pluto is considered the modern ruler of Scorpio. When these energies interact, the impulse to investigate, pursue, uncover, and understand can become extremely strong. But because the quincunx operates through a blind spot, that intensity may not immediately identify its true target. Instead, the mind can attach itself to something nearby and convince you that solving that external problem will finally relieve the internal tension. You might spend hours scrolling through information without noticing how much time has disappeared. You might check the profile of an ex or a coworker, even after promising yourself that you would stop. You might become absorbed in political news or conspiracy content and continue digging long after the information has stopped being useful. Eventually, you may emerge feeling more anxious, exhausted, or emotionally saturated than before, while still being unable to explain what initially pulled you into the search. The deeper psychological interpretation is that the mind may be scanning the environment for an explanation to an internal alarm. You feel urgency, but you cannot identify the origin of that urgency. So the mind searches. It finds an argument, a relationship problem, a news story, a message, a social media post, or some unresolved interaction and says, "There it is, that must be the reason I feel this way." But the external target may only be receiving energy that originated somewhere deeper. The real issue may be the buried fear of powerlessness. It may be an old relationship with control. It may be the part of you that learned somewhere in your history that relaxing your defenses was dangerous. That is why the most useful question when you catch yourself obsessing is not simply, "What am I trying to find?" but "What am I afraid will happen if I stop searching?" That question changes the entire direction of the investigation. Instead of feeding the obsession, you begin examining the emotion underneath it. Instead of asking which external situation needs to be controlled, you begin asking which internal fear is demanding control. That can become the moment of recognition this transit is trying to create, and just when you begin to think you have finally located the hidden source of the tension, another layer enters the picture. Only 6 hours later, Mars moves into a square with Neptune. This creates a very different psychological atmosphere. If the Mars and Pluto quincunx is symbolically like directing a light towards something hidden, the Neptune square can make the scene difficult to interpret immediately afterward. Neptune is associated with dissolution, blurred boundaries, uncertainty, confusion, and the loss of clear definition. Mars, by contrast, represents action, initiative, movement, and the instinct to know what you want and pursue it. Puts those energies together through a square, and the experience can feel like having intense motivation without a reliable map. You may recognize that something needs to change while having absolutely no idea what the correct next step should be. That is why the combination can become so disorienting toward the end of this weekend and into early next week. First, Pluto brings attention towards something hidden that may have been influencing you. Then Neptune can make it difficult to immediately determine what that discovery means or what action should follow. You may feel as though you have finally identified the existence of a problem, but the solution remains covered in fog. Your motivation may fluctuate. You may feel physically depleted even after sleeping. You may experience emotional flatness, reduced enthusiasm, or a temporary distance from the things that normally give you direction. You may question your instincts because the usual sense of certainty is missing. And this is precisely where another important issue enters the story, because when clarity becomes weaker while emotional intensity remains high, the possibility of deception becomes much more significant. The fog does not necessarily mean that nothing is happening. It means that what is happening may be difficult to interpret accurately, and that distinction becomes increasingly important as this sequence unfolds. The danger here is not always another person deceiving you, although that can happen, but the much quieter form of deception that happens inside your own mind. You can create an explanation for your emotions and repeat it so often that eventually it feels like the truth. You can tell yourself that everything is perfectly fine, while something inside you knows it is not. Or you can move to the opposite extreme and convince yourself that the worst possible outcome is already inevitable. Both responses can pull you away from reality. That is why this is not the moment to make a major decision simply because an emotion feels intense. It is not the moment to send the message you know you may regret later. It is not the moment to destroy a relationship in the heat of frustration, walk away from your job in an emotional explosion, or make an irreversible choice because you desperately need the discomfort to stop. The atmosphere created by the Neptune square is too unclear for that kind of certainty. When the emotional fog becomes thick, the wisest response is not to force your way through it. Let yourself experience what is coming up. Write your thoughts down if that helps you separate one feeling from another. Give yourself enough space to observe what is happening without immediately turning every emotion into an action. You do not have to solve everything today. You do not have to understand every feeling the moment it appears. You can simply acknowledge it and wait. Clarity returns when the fog passes, and this period of uncertainty does not last forever. That is the part I want you to remember before fear convinces you that you must act immediately. You have time, and once the emotional intensity settles, you will be able to see the same situation from a much clearer position. So the real question becomes, how do you move through this energy without allowing it to control you? First, release your obsession with the outcome. Look at the area of your life where you have been gripping the hardest, where you keep checking, pushing, planning, analyzing, demanding certainty, or trying to make another person behave exactly the way you need them to behave. That may be the very place where you are being asked to loosen your hold. I know that can feel completely backwards. When you sense danger, your instinct is usually to tighten everything. You want more certainty, more information, more control, more guarantees. But the quincunx does not symbolically respond well to that approach. It calls for adjustment. It asks you to recognize that the strategy you have been using may no longer be producing the result you want. Sometimes the answer is not greater effort. Sometimes the answer is approaching the situation from an entirely different direction. Think about how exhausting it becomes when you repeatedly push against a door that will not open. You can use more force, become more frustrated, and eventually convince yourself that you simply need to push harder. But perhaps the problem is not your strength. Perhaps the direction is wrong. That is the kind of flexibility this energy asks from you. The second step is to give the physical energy somewhere constructive to go. Mars and Pluto can create an experience that is intensely physical. You may feel it through your muscles, your jaw, your stomach, or the constant sensation that your body is ready to react. If that energy has nowhere to move, it can become anxiety, restless sleep, insomnia, agitation, or that strange combination of feeling completely exhausted while still being unable to settle down. Your mind may be tired, but your body still feels switched on. One way to work with that is through deliberate physical movement. Go for a demanding workout. Take a long walk. Clean the entire apartment. Organize something that requires your hands and your attention. Give your body a structured task that allows the accumulated tension to move somewhere rather than remaining trapped inside you. There is something powerful about physical action when the mind is trying to process emotions that have not yet become conscious thoughts. You do not necessarily have to figure everything out intellectually before you begin feeling better. Sometimes the body needs an opportunity to discharge the pressure first. Once that pressure decreases, the emotional information underneath it can become easier to recognize. The third step is to pay extremely close attention to your integrity. With Neptune forming its square to Mars the very next morning, there can be a strong temptation to communicate indirectly, manipulate circumstances, become passive-aggressive, hide part of the truth, or shape a situation so that you get the outcome you want without having to openly admit what you are doing. Resist that temptation. If something needs to be said, say it honestly. If something is bothering you, acknowledge it honestly. If you are afraid, admit that you are afraid instead of disguising the fear as anger or control. The more direct you are with yourself and with other people, the less opportunity there is for confusion to take over. Even small acts of dishonesty can become complicated under an atmosphere where clarity is already difficult to maintain. A subtle manipulation may seem harmless in the moment, but anything built on distortion has a way of becoming unstable. So whatever surfaces during this transit, meet it with honesty. Do not create another layer of confusion to cover the confusion that already exists. And then comes the deepest step of all. Ask yourself what you are actually afraid of. Not what happened during the argument, not the immediate problem at work, not the message you received, not the tension inside the relationship. Those may only be the visible surface. Go underneath them. Ask what the situation represents to you emotionally. Ask what you believe you might lose. Ask what you think would happen if you stopped controlling the outcome. Ask what part of you feels unsafe when you cannot guarantee what happens next. That deeper fear is where the real work is happening. This is the psychological territory that Pluto symbolizes as it excavates what has been buried. You may discover that the surface conflict was never the entire story. You may discover that your reaction was connected to an older fear, an old survival pattern, or a belief you developed long ago about what you must do to remain safe. And if you can look directly at that truth without immediately trying to suppress it, escape from it, or control it, something begins to change. Not necessarily all at once, and not necessarily comfortably, but in a way that can become permanent, because once you truly recognize a pattern, you cannot completely return to the innocence of not knowing it exists. This is where the larger story of this week comes together. There is a difference between who you have been and who you are beginning to become. The solar eclipse in Leo on August 12th began that process by challenging the identity you have been carrying. It stripped away some of the performance, the false identity, and the protective mask that may have become so familiar that you stopped realizing you were wearing it. Now the Mars-Pluto quincunx is moving deeper toward what existed underneath that mask. The hidden fear, the buried need for control, the survival pattern you developed years ago that may still be directing your choices automatically. Seeing those things can feel confronting, but it is not a punishment. It is an opportunity because you cannot consciously transform a pattern that remains invisible to you. Awareness is the first opening. Once you can see what has been running in the background, you can begin choosing differently. And I believe that is why this period can become one of the most transformative windows of the year for you. The person who moves through this weekend with greater awareness does not necessarily become someone who controls everything perfectly. It can be the opposite. You may become someone who no longer needs to control every outcome. Someone who does not have to hold every situation with white knuckles. Someone who does not need to perform strength because their strength has become internal rather than something they must constantly prove. That version of you may have been waiting underneath the fear for a long time. This moment can create the space for that version to step forward. I am not going to tell you that the process will feel easy. It may not. Sitting with discomfort requires courage, especially when your instinct is to distract yourself, become obsessive, force an answer, or return to a familiar pattern simply because it feels safer. But the people who are willing to remain present with what they feel, who are willing to loosen their grip, who are willing to examine the fear underneath the reaction, and who refuse to run from the truth they are beginning to see, can emerge from this week with a completely different relationship to themselves. The transformation is not about becoming someone who never feels fear again. It is about becoming someone who no longer allows fear to make every decision. So if you are still with me, thank you for staying through this entire journey. If what I have described has reflected something you have been experiencing, consider subscribing for more content like this. And I would genuinely like to know what this week has felt like for you. Have you noticed unusual tension in your body? Have you felt a stronger need to control things that normally would not bother you? Have you caught yourself becoming fixated on something without understanding why it has such a powerful hold over your attention? Share what you have been experiencing, because you may discover that you are not the only person moving through this strange emotional atmosphere. Take care of yourself this weekend, give yourself room to breathe, and remember that you do not have to force clarity before clarity is ready to return. The most important realization may already be unfolding inside you, and what comes next begins with what you are finally willing to see.